everybody gets quiet.
Is that like flashing the lights a minute before theater show is going to start?
Am I that boring?
I've been doing this since this afternoon. 6:59.
We're like 30 seconds.
Oh.
I think you're exactly right.
Well.
Didn't say your name, so drink it. Drink's already in, so I didn't ask.
Call this meeting to order. If you please rise with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call, please.
Mr. Bittner?
Here.
Mr. Lunder?
Here.
Mrs. Thompson? Here. Mrs. Moore? Here. Mr. Shaboo?
Here.
Mr. Morris?
Here.
Mr. Johnson?
Here. Approval of the minutes. Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes of March 8th? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve? Motion to approve by Mrs. Thompson, seconded by Mr. Morris. Roll call, please.
Mr. Bittner?
Aye.
Mr. Lunder?
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson?
Aye.
Mrs. Moore? Aye. Mr. Shaboo?
Aye.
Mr. Morris?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye. Correspondence. Clerk, is there any correspondence?
I have no correspondence tonight.
Does any member of council have correspondence tonight? Mr. Morris?
Yes, Mr. President, I received an email, as did Mr. Lunger, I believe, according to the email, about a woman on Erie Drive in Mentor complaining about storm drainage inoperational. I don't like. She was talking to Mentor on the Lake Councilman, not the Mentor Councilman, and she needs to approach the city of Mentor instead of us. That was it.
I emailed that woman back on Sunday when I got the same email, told her, and I told her who her council person was, and she contacted that council.
Anybody else have correspondence this evening? Okay, we will move on to administrative and department head reports. Mayor and Safety Director, Mr. Eva, good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Johnson, members of council, the public here this evening. I have no reports.
Administrative Director, Mrs. Bartone, good evening.
The only thing I have to report is I received a call from the local ambulance post. There will not be a breakage.
Thank you. Law Director, Mr. Lyons, good evening.
Good evening. I have no report.
And our special guest, Chief Keeling, good evening.
Good evening, Mr. President. How are you this evening?
Good, how are you?
Good. I have a very brief report. February 24th, Civil Service Commission conducted a test for the position of full-time police officer. 8 candidates signed up for the test, and 6 candidates took the exam. All 6 candidates passed the exam and will continue the oral interviews, which are scheduled for April 2nd. All 6 candidates that are being considered are currently part-time employees. Mentor Public Library recently contacted the department and requested a police officer to speak to seniors regarding scams and protecting themselves from fraud. Sergeant Downmeyer is putting together a program. We'll be speaking sometime next month, and I'll put that on our Facebook page so everybody else knows about it. We will again be applying for the Ohio Law Enforcement Body Armor Grant offered through the Ohio Department of Workers' Compensation. The grant will pay 75% of the cost of new vests. For those officers who need one, Body Armor Life has a span of about 5 years. We've had a dispatcher on extended leave. I'd like to acknowledge and thank the remaining members of the team who stepped up to cover the open shifts. We had a patrol car taken out of service by an intoxicated driver who struck it on the Andrews Road while an officer was assisting the fire department with blocking the road due to a utility pole fire. The officer was uninjured, however, the vehicle had about $6,500 worth of damage done to it. We just picked up the car today, so we'll be back to service. Our annual jail inspection will be occurring sometime within the next month. Lieutenant Forsythe, who is our jail administrator, is working with the state inspector and our secretary to file all the necessary records needed for the review. And that concludes my report.
Thank you. Are there any questions for the administration or department heads? Yes, Mr.
Ms.
Morris.
Bartone, did the AMVET say why they were not having the meeting?
Chief, did the driver have insurance?
No. Seems to be a little foggy there. His lapsed. The vehicle belonged to a family member. Their insurance is saying, well, a family member was driving it. So I think our insurance company is still working that out.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. Hearing none, we will move on to board and committee commission reports. First up is the zoning committee.
Zoning committee met on 3/15/2022. Start time was 6 p.m. In attendance was myself, Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Lunder, Mr. Morris, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Moore, Kevin Bittner, and Mayor Eva. And there was also several residents in the audience. Mr. Al Busher explained that his goal was to make zoning ordinance 1244.05 clearer and easier for the planning and zoning committee to understand. The committee discussed that we needed more time to review his proposal. It is agreed that we start reviewing it at our next meeting. Planning and Zoning Commission forwarded their completed zoning ordinance 1255 called Lakefront Plan Development District. The zoning committee approved the final copy to be placed hopefully on the March 22nd agenda. That concludes my report.
Ordinance committee.
Ordinance committee met last night at 6 p.m. We discussed the right of way, and we are asking council to leave the right of way as is stated in our current ordinances. We discussed CRA, new construction with a different levels for years. Or we were also throwing out new construction with a tear down versus new construction on a piece of vacant land. We were discussing that, or we were also discussing looking at the lot sizes by district for CRAs or versus year built. So we're just looking at all of those different possibilities of what we can do with CRA. We also talked about rentals and the zoning ordinance, and Mr. Lyons, I will be sending something to you tonight. We would like to update that with council's approval of possible owner responsible for home inspections for every 3 years. We haven't really tied down a date, 3 years, 5 years. And then that owner would be responsible to get that inspection report to the administration, and that would stay on file, and they would be responsible for doing that every 3 years or whatever we determine to be sufficient. That way we are not putting ourselves in a liability for home inspections, and that concludes my report.
Are there any other committee or commissions that haven't listed? Okay, hearing none, we will open this portion of the public to speak. If you would like to speak, please come to the lectern, state your name and address for the record.
Schaefer, 7761 Sharon Drive, in Illinois. The snow cone place over here is a wonderful thing. I would like to find it, enjoy it very much. But I have
noticed that there are cars parking on the wrong side of the road, on the right side of the road. And I thought there was a sign that said no parking underneath the speed limit sign, but it's no longer there, so I don't know. I thought it was there one time. Is there anything we can do? It's not a big issue right now, but summer's coming and guess what? We're gonna start parking all over it. It's a small narrow road. You can't have people parking on both sides. Yes.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to speak? Anybody online wish to speak? Hearing none, we will move on. Legislation for council. I'm asking to amend the agenda to add on ordinance 2022-0-05, which is the chapter 1255, the lakefront planned unit development that Mr. Shaboo mentioned. Is there a motion to amend the agenda to add that?
Motion made.
Motion made by Mrs. Thompson,
I'll second
seconded
it.
by Mr. Bittner. Is there any discussion on the motion? Yes, Mr. Morris.
I have a problem with amending that unless we're going to do the 3 readings. For the simple fact, this is something that's important that the public should be made aware of. And it shouldn't be railroaded through. If we amend it, as long as we go for 2 or 3 readings, I don't have a problem.
My intention is for it to go full 3 readings. I don't intend for it to, but I mean, that's up to council, but, okay. Any other discussion on that? Okay, roll call on amending the agenda.
Mr. Bittner,
Aye.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye.
Mrs. Moore,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
No,
Mr. Johnson.
Aye. All right, first ordinance number 2022-0-03. Clerk, if you could please read it by its title.
Ordinance number 2022-0-03. An ordinance amending codified ordinance 212.01 posting places.
Is there any questions or discussion on the ordinance? Is there any motions?
Motion to suspend.
Motion's been made to suspend the rules by Mr. Bittner, seconded by Mrs. Thompson. Is there any discussion on the motion?
The reason I want to suspend this, I mean, the more places we post it, the more people that possibly could see it, so
That was mine.
get it out there as fast.
Anybody else? Roll call on suspension of the rules.
Mr. Bittner,
Aye.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye.
Mrs. Moore,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
aye.
Mr. Johnson.
Aye. Is there a motion for passage?
So moved.
Second.
Motion made by Mr. Bittner, seconded by Mrs. Thompson. Roll call, please.
Mr. Bittner.
Aye.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye.
Mrs. Moore,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson.
Aye. Ordinance number 2022-0-04. If you please read it by its title.
Ordinance number 2022-0-04, opting out of House Bill 172 and reaffirming the ban on discharging, igniting, or exploding fireworks in the city of Mentor on the Lake as set forth in Chapter 672 of the codified ordinances of the city of Mentor on the Lake and declaring an emergency.
Are there any questions on this ordinance? Are there any motions?
Motion to suspend.
Second.
Motion to suspend by Mrs. Thompson, seconded by Mr. Lunder. Is there any discussion on the motion to suspend?
I have a suggestion. Maybe let it go 3 readings. It doesn't go into effect. My understanding of July 1st. That way it may get out to the public a little bit more. Looking at the agenda in terms of seeing what we're going to do. Once it's passed, maybe they won't be- But I'm recommending for a change.
I'd like to make a comment based on Mr. Lyon's observation that I agree that this too is something that the public should have input to. Because if we suspend the rules and pass it tonight, which I support passing this, people are going to complain like, heck, why did we do this? That's their right to set off these fireworks. And granted, we have a basis of which to do this. So I would rather try to preempt any complaining. If the public knows we're looking at this, if they don't speak up and we pass it, shame on them.
Argue against myself. Not based.
Better than anyone I know.
Not based on what was just said, but, you know, perhaps if it is passed tonight, if it's put on the website right away indicating that it has been banned, that gives people more notice rather than passing it. You know. So I think there's good arguments on both sides.
Why don't we compromise? They have 2 readings and then vote on.
I would be okay with that.
All right, anyway, there's been a motion to suspend the rules. It has been seconded, so we'll go ahead with a roll call vote on that motion.
Okay. Mr. Bittner,
No.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye.
Mrs. Moore. Mr. Shaboo,
No.
Mr. Morris,
No,
Mr. Johnson,
No, the motion to suspend the rules has failed. Ordinance number 2022-0-05, if you could please read it by its title.
ordinance number 2022-0-05. An ordinance creating chapter 1255 Lakefront Planned Unit Development, PUD, District of the Codified Ordinances.
Any questions on this ordinance? Or any motions? Hearing none, this will go on to second reading. Old business, review of council rules. So now that we have approved the additional posting places, we can update the council rules to include that now. That'd be correct. Then we can approve the council rules, hopefully at the next meeting, hopefully meeting after that. New business, discussion, summer meetings, recess. Everyone, you know, I've always hated having an August recess. I despised it. This is a very long stretch where there is no meetings between the last meeting in July and the first meeting, which doesn't come until like mid-September. So I wanted to go ahead and get this proposal out there that instead, what we could do is have one meeting a month through the summer months instead.
unless something comes up. at the end.
Unless something comes up, but I mean, at least having a meeting a month, then
Starting in-
we're always going to have. That's up for discussion. My preference would be just July and August, so we're only missing 2 meetings, but you know. I'm a slave driver, so.
I would be okay with that.
Just July and August, taking one.
Yeah.
And so we would have the first meeting of each month. Take the second meeting off,
You're talking July and August, not June.
just July and August.
Would that apply to committee meetings as well?
Yes, you have to meet in the first half of the month, and the second half you don't have to.
Okay.
That's up to you guys to figure out if you guys want to have meetings or not have meetings during those times, but. So is there a motion to have a summer recess of the second meeting of both July and August off?
So many.
Second,
Motion made by Mrs. Thompson, seconded by Mr. Morris. Roll call, please.
Mr. Bittner,
aye.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye.
Mrs. Moore.
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Abstain. Vote for it. I want you people to work. Okay, is there any other new business tonight?
Yes, sir. With the new district, will we discuss rezoning versus overlay?
Yes, so, all right, with the chapter 1255, which is now on the agenda, that we have put on second reading. Right now, it would rezone that whatever property we decide to use the PUD, this new district on. The question is, do we want to add into this legislation anything about making it an overlay district, in meaning that we would create this PUD, but it would be over top of the business district or whatever district is currently that location. And so if something happened with the PUD, in terms of, because the PUD is dependent upon the actual development plan. So once that rezoning would occur, it is set to that zoning, that plan that has been put forth. So the question is, do we want to have it reversible so that it goes back to business if something were to fall apart, something not happen there? Question is to Mr. Lyons, do we need to do that? Does there need to be wording for an overlay district, or how does that work?
The way that this one is drafted, each be come before the city, you have to rezone that lot wherever it is. Like, sure, I mean, to the district that's being created as part of it. So this legislation not only, sets the standard for what you can do in a PUD, it also creates a specific zoning classification for this PUD district. So if this thing was proposed at the corner of Lakeshore Boulevard in Danville and didn't get built, but it was rezoned that way, that's the only thing they'd be allowed to put it in, unless it got rezoned back to commercial and soon that business. Well, a lot of these PUDs are overlay districts, in other words, where you designate a certain area, perhaps it's just Lakeshore Boulevard, from point A, to point B, or Andrew Road from point A, to point B, as being this, PUD overlay district. And in addition to what's allowed there under the existing zoning code, you could also do this PUD, if you meet all the standards, it's approved from the planning commission. And also there's development agreements. The way it's written now, I think you guys actually have a little bit more control at council. If it's an overlay district, it usually just stays with the planning commission and the administration. You guys exercising control over the zoning, because it has to be passed by council for the zoning. In essence, you're controlling the PUD. I think it's worth discussing and maybe taking a look at some other cities in terms of what they do. And also, if you do want it, I keep pausing on that, so we're kind of pausing here. But if you keep going here, but it might be a good idea to, take a look at what some other cities do, and also where you might want to have, this overlay district in the city. I don't think that you'd want it all along Andrew Road. I mean, that seems like it might be too much, because there's much of it's commercial, and now you're going to be able to put residential in there, and you don't want it.
Right. I am going to refer this back to the zoning committee. I want them to discuss this overlay concept and report back to council. Any other new business? Hearing none. We'll now open this part of the meeting to the public again. To speak, if you would like to speak, please come to the lectern, state your name and address for the record. Does anyone online wish to speak?
Yes,
Go ahead.
Dorinda Meyer, 7734 Sharon Drive. I can't tell who brought it up before, somebody from the audience there, about the parking here by the Pelican Snowballs at the top of our street. I agree with that person. Customers have parked right up along the side of the street, real close to the intersection and on the wrong side of the road, kind of almost blocking in a way. Because I know when I came home from the grocery store yesterday, turning from Andrews Road onto Sharon, there was a van or car parked there, and it made it a little bit difficult congestion wise, and they're parked on the wrong side of the street. So if a no parking sign can be put up there, or talk to the owners over there to suggest some other parking alternative arrangements they can have. So if the mayor or a council or somebody can kind of address that with them, it would be nice. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else online? Wishes to speak? Hearing none, we will move on to announcements and settings of meetings. First up, we have the Parks and Recreation Board, Wednesday, March 23rd at 6 p.m. That's tomorrow night. We also have the regular agenda meeting, Thursday, April 7th, 2022 at 6 p.m. Regular meeting of council, April 12th at 7 p.m. I would like to hear a zoning committee meeting.
Planning and zoning meets April 4th at 6 p.m.
Planning and zoning is April 4th at 6 p.m.
And if the other two don't mind, maybe we could have it afterwards if it isn't too long. The planning and zoning commission,
Sorry, which meeting is first?
planning and zoning. We could do ours afterwards. That way Mr. Busher can be there to talk to us. To be convenient. for him.
Did we check with him to make sure that that date works for him? Because I know at the last meeting that.
He's on the commission, isn't he?
He's on plan, so, yeah.
He's on planning and zoning,
Okay.
so I'm sure you'll be there already.
Because I know he had to cut short the meeting the other night because he had plans.
So it's planning and zoning at 6 p.m. on Monday, April 4th. Zoning committee at 7 p.m. Monday, April 4th, correct?
Ordinance is going to be April 7th at 6:30 p.m.
Ordinance April 7th at 6:30. Anybody else? Don't have any meetings next week, so feel free to schedule something. I'm gonna feel like I have nothing to do. All right, I guess that's all the meeting schedule. Is there a motion for adjournment?
Motion made.
Second.
Motion made by Mrs. Thompson, seconded by Mr. Morris. Roll call, please.
Mr. Bittner,
Aye.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye.
Mrs. Moore.
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson.
Aye. This meeting is adjourned.